Well, hello, and welcome to yet another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers. I'm your host, David the Skeptic, and I'm joined by some folks. I almost hate to mention them because some of them may not choose to be on the mic. I'll call them anyway. Andrew, Darren, Matt, how you doing? Glad you're here, or kind of here, or whatever form of here you are. We are going to continue our conversation on sex. This might end up being a solo show. I have no idea. It might end up being a conversation. We will have some guests next week. I heard from Russell this morning. Those of you who are the praying kind, I'm just going to put out a call to ask for some general blessings toward Russell's way. He's going through some stuff, and I'm sure that he would appreciate that. Those of you who are New Age kinds, send your mental energies his way. Those of you who are neither have some thoughts and more thoughts for Russell. So there are reasons why he's not here. He's not boycotting the show. He'll be here next week. We'll have some Christian guests on then. So today I want to talk about the theological aspects of sexuality. I think that that's a very important thing. It's not just because I'm a theology wonk and I like talking about theology. It's just a bonus. I actually think that you have to talk about theology, though, if we want to understand some of how we got here, because I think that a lot of our popular understandings and mores around sex are dominated by theology. And so I think this is one of those areas in society where religion won. And we're just now starting to dig out from under some of that. Is very, very difficult to do. So I want to take a look at that. I want to take a look at some of how we got here. I've got 5 things I'm going to go over. And so I will start right in with number 1. Does prohibiting sex outside of marriage make sense outside of a religious context? So I was a Christian once upon a time, and I just accepted, for whatever reason, that sex outside of marriage was wrong. In fact, there are 2 words in the Bible that often get conflated. One of them is adultery. One of them is fornication. And I don't know what the proper meaning of those words are. I'm just going to tell you right off. So if there's some biblical scholars out there who know more about it than I do, feel free to chime in. skepticsandsseekers.squarespace.com. But the way I always cast it out was adultery was cheating. So you're married and you're having sex with someone else, and fornication was just sex in general outside of marriage. I have heard it described the other way. I've heard the 2 described as the same thing. They often get conflated. I don't know, honestly, what the difference is between those 2 things, but I always had a separation in my mind of a married person having sex outside of marriage, and then a person who's not married having sex. Both were wrong. Any of you in here have any insight on fornication and adultery before I move forward?
Well, I think as long as everyone involved is being honest and not piling on expectations on someone else without consent, then I don't see why it wouldn't, either outside or inside of a religion. I mean, if you believe that a God exists and he created us and he apparently created sex to feel good, so it seems sort of odd that he would make it feel good and then demand that we don't do it.
Right. So there is a natural component to this. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but the natural component is that sex is it's such a fundamental and strong drive in humans that it's outsized. It's too strong of a drive. It seems there are situations where it seems where the sex drive is stronger than the survival instinct, and that just seems kind of out of whack. But then to have that drive, uh, plus a bunch of restrictions on top of it, seems cruel. But more than that, we get the sex drive very early in life. So at least by 12, uh, people usually figure out all by themselves how to masturbate. And the reason they figure it out is because they they really want to. They have a drive, and they're pushed to do it. But I can tell you that there are plenty of kids where that drive wakes up before 12. And so my point is, you've got this crazy strong drive that seems to be extremely natural, but it also is kind of wrong to do anything with it until you're crazy old. Our brains don't fully develop until we're about 24, 25, 26 in that area. Uh, that would seem crazy to say that, from the time your sex drive wakes up, you shouldn't have sex until your brain fully develops. And so, we had some discussion about this last week. What is the middle point? What is the point where you say, well, okay, sex is okay? Usually we don't say 12 or 13. And so there's just this kind of challenging um, point of how we nail that down, and where we say it's okay and where it's okay for kids to experiment. And there's the physical and the mentally emotional and cultural and safety aspects of it all that are very confusing. But from a God perspective, if you're saying that God made us like this, none of that makes sense at all. If you're saying that evolution has made a hash of it, great, I gotcha. But if you're saying God did this on purpose, well, that's an evil God. The only thing that the Christian can say to this, it's the only thing that I've ever heard a Christian say to this. In fact, I heard a Christian say this last week, was that, well, maybe God didn't make us that way, but because of the fall, because of sin, then we have a sex drive.
Yeah, but that would only make sense if God didn't create the fall and what the rules for what would happen if the fall happened.
Right. No,
So,
I perfectly agree with you there. It's like it's a failure mode. So I think all of us know a little bit about computers and programming that happen to be on this panel. And so when I say failure mode, all of you know what I'm talking about. So if you have a piece of software, one failure mode might be something went wrong and it knows exactly what happened, and it puts a screen on your display, and it says, crash 414, and it might give some description of what that particular crash means. And then if you're on a Mac, it gives you the opportunity to send a crash report to either Apple or the developer or what have you. And so that's a failure mode. But in the God case, the failure mode for humans would be the equivalent of you're running a piece of software and something goes wrong and it blows up your house. That's not a failure mode. That's a terrorist attack. We wouldn't call that a failure mode at all. And so when you say, well, the DNA of the human structure just blew up completely, well, that's not a failure mode from eating a piece of fruit. That's God setting off a bomb. So
I think
there's a difference.
what's fascinating to me about blaming sex drive on the fall is, okay, fine. Let's just pretend for a moment that that's where this sort of early onset timing for sex drive happens, and it doesn't coincide with our intellectual development. So let's say that the fall is responsible for that. What I find fascinating is that the Christians say, "Oh yeah," and God's response to the fall. Well, that all makes perfect sense. And this God that we're talking about, he's a free will agent. He could choose. to respond with his commands and edicts, his injunctions and precepts. He could choose to respond in any way that he wanted. But so if you blame the fall on this early sex drive and only later our intellectual capacity, that still doesn't answer why the Jewish God, who eventually became the Christian God, has the sort of very strange responses to human sex drive that he has.
I think the apologetic that I heard about that is that God doesn't actually have free will. He's basically a robot, but they call that a different type of free will than we have. It's like perfect free will or something like that. But it basically means he's a robot and can't do anything, and isn't powerful enough to fix anything that he broke or anything like that. It's kind of makes God infantile at that point.
Right. So the fall happens, and now God wants your foreskin.
Right.
Okay. So let's just look at this question directly, so that we can get to the rest of it. Does it make sense in a Christian context to limit sex to just within marriage and not outside of marriage? So the question is actually, does it make sense outside of a religious context? I think the answer is no for me. I've thought about this all week, and I can't think of any good reason why people who aren't married shouldn't be able to have sex. It's not like you only get a sex drive when you're married. So I don't see any reason why adults can't act on that. But from a religious point of view, Darren earlier asked off mic, does it make sense to limit sex to marriage even inside of a religious context? And my answer to that is, I think it's actually harder to justify in a Christian context than it is outside of a Christian context to just limit sex to inside of a marriage. Because in the Christian context, if we are looking at the God of the Old Testament and the behavior of that, God allowed men to have multiple wives. In fact, it was enshrined into law that men had multiple wives, because if a person had several brothers, and one of the brothers died, the next oldest brother would have to take on that person's wife along with his wife. So he'd have two wives at that point. So even if you only married one wife, you were potentially going to end up being a polygamist under this law. So this is a situation where there are multiple marriages, but even outside of that, it seemed to be okay for men of God, especially men of wealth who were men of God, to have concubines. Now, I don't know when concubines were first introduced as a thing, but a concubine is basically a mistress, a girlfriend, a sex partner that's not your wife. But that is also maybe a part of your household, maybe a female slave, maybe one of your servants. So concubines were okay, and you could have sex with your concubines. So there didn't seem to be a prohibition about not having sex with someone who wasn't your one and only wife in the Old Testament. And so we get some more clarity on that in the New Testament, but there doesn't seem to be anything fundamentally wrong with it. Because the God of the Bible certainly never forbade it, never suggested at any point that it was wrong, never told his own people not to do it. So I don't actually know what the Christian argument is outside of a few New Testament passages, and I'm not entirely sure that you could say that those passages would have overthrown the Jewish understanding of morality on this issue.
If you don't mind, I'll take a swing at it, just to give the Christians something to talk about. I'll try to defend the Christian position for a moment if you want me to.
Sure, because I can't.
Well, I'll just go ahead and say there's a fail coming up. But here's the way it is taught in some seminary classes. So in conservative hermeneutics, we've talked about this occasionally in the past. There are certain kinds of examples that take on the force of command, a thou shalt or a thou shalt not, right? And at least in some hermeneutic traditions, the idea that God made an original couple, and Adam and an Eve, right? And these are the same people that say God made Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve, but it's maybe for later. These are the people who would say that this example of an original couple, this first couple, takes on the force of command by the very nature of its example. And only later did people, somewhere around the flood, that kind of time frame, start to violate this example that God set forth by creating this first couple, and that we are supposed to, by implication, we're supposed to necessarily infer that was God's design for us, and so I do think you'd run into that. Now, how far that'll get you, well, that's worth talking about. But I think that's where they'd start.
Well,
Yeah,
it
but that
gets you
doesn't.
very far for me. But
Yeah, because that doesn't show a fundamental wrongness to it. It's just a God said not to do it. So it's sort of a might makes right, God commanded it type human
well, the thing is,
hermeneutic.
God didn't
Whereas,
even say not to
they'd say
do
that.
it.
Right.
God didn't even say not to do it, though. And so if you
well, in their
say, well,
head canon, he did.
right, but if you say God created Adam and Eve and therefore created a prototype for marriages, well, first of all, there was no marriage, there was no ceremony, there was no, this is your mate for life. You must stay with each other for life and only have sex with it. There was no such command, so you have to headcanon that in. And then when we do see men with multiple wives popping up and concubines and so forth, we don't see God saying, why are you perverting the marriage model that I gave you? And in fact, we see God participating in allowing men to have multiple wives. The whole children of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, that did not come from one woman. It came from two women. A little passion play that God Himself orchestrated, and so it's really hard to go to this creation story and say, well, that's the model. And then the other reason why it's hard to go to this creation story and say this is the model, because we have people who are saying, oh, well, that's mytho-history. You can't take all of that literally, and so, but you can take this literally, even though there are no details about how this was supposed to work in the story. You can take your head canon about it literally.
Well, and if you're not going to be a mythohistorian, if you're going to take the Genesis account as literal, right? So you've got one man and one woman, and they sort of get the ball rolling. There's a problem starting in about Genesis 4, when you have daughter. Where did their children? It almost seems that at some point there had to be some incest.
Right. That is exactly the thing I was going to say next.
Oh, sorry.
So no, that's fine. It's out there for anybody to say. And hello, Dell. By the way, it's out there for anyone to say, because the fact is, once again, if you're taking this as kind of a model, then you also have to say, well, then it's also right for brothers and sisters to have sex, or fathers and daughters to have sex for the purpose of procreation. Because that's what would have had to happen. Unless you buy the theory that God made some other people over there somewhere for the purposes of procreation with it. Look, Christians have tried to get around this incest problem in lots of interesting and creative ways that don't make a lot of sense of the text in front of us. And so it all becomes headcanon at that point. So I would think that a Christian would have a fairly hard time making an actual case that Genesis is the thing that grounds this. But let me just ask on the secular side of it, and just try to challenge us a little bit. Are there some reasons why a person should not have sex in marriage? Now, I'm going to go ahead and state my position. I don't think there is. Furthermore, I think if you try to create a society where no one had sex until they were married and no one could get married until they were, say, 18, I think that we would have a destruction of society. I think it would be worse than when we tried to prohibit alcohol. I think it would be the end of civilization, not a better civilization, because the drive is simply too strong. And to accommodate it, what we would end up doing is lowering the marriage age to about 14. We would have a lot of very early, very bad marriages, which would also, I think, destroy civilization. So the consequences of trying to suggest that sex outside of marriage is wrong, I think, don't take into account any reality of the kind of people we are and the kind of society that we would have. I think the consequences would be devastating. But can anyone think of maybe a good reason to ban sex outside of marriage, for a secular reason? I know that the Christian would say, well, there's spiritual reasons, but I just want to exhaust the secular component.
I can't think of any.
For me, it depends on whether you're using ban, capital B ban, or lowercase b ban, as in we had an agreement. So I think Darren said something about this a few minutes ago. If we're going to have this conversation maturely, and we are, well, one of the things you hope that people that are engaged in sexual relationships are doing is having open conversation about the needs of everybody involved in the relationship, two or more. And so it may very well be that you have some agreement that there's serial monogamy, as a for instance, right? And so while you're dating this person, you're not going to have sex with anybody else. That may take the force of a ban, but maybe not in the sense you mean it.
Yeah,
So
no, by
beyond
ban,
that,
I mean illegal. It's taboo to, if you're not married, have sex. That would be wrong. And so let's say that age is not an issue. You just never married. You're 30 years old, but you can't have sex. Let's say you married, but your husband died or your wife died. You can't have sex anymore until you marry again. That seems like the kind of short-sighted thinking about sex that, I mean, no society could survive it. There is no society that lives that way. And I think one of the reasons is because any society that's ever tried it doesn't exist. So that said, the only thing left for a reason to ban sex out of marriage would be spiritual harm. Dale, if you're around in a little while, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about some of this, because some of this is theory that comes from you, and I know that you've given it some thought, if that's okay. But right now, I just want to get through these 5 questions and knock them out of the way. So in this question, I actually name check you, Dale. I suppose I could ask this question in a way that doesn't name check you, but I would have to think, and I don't want to do that. Dale has expressed a view of unauthorized sex acts, and I will just say Dale is not the only one who has this view. By the way, he's just one of the few people who would admit to having the view, I think. But he's expressed a view of unauthorized sex acts in or out of marriage. In that these unauthorized or unnatural acts would be prohibited based on spiritual harm. And so one of the things that I wanted to hear for Christians on the board is, can you tell me more about spiritual harm? What is the spiritual harm that happens if you engage in unnatural prohibited sex acts, and what are unnatural prohibited sex acts? I mean, how would we even know what an unnatural prohibited sex act would be outside of, say, divine revelation? And also, what does divine revelation tell us about sex acts? I don't. Honestly, I don't. I don't think I could get very far with this theory as a Christian. But Andrew, I'm going to have to punt to you again as having gone through some a form of seminary. I noticed that. Well, so I'll go to Andrew first, and Dale, if you want to step in here, you would be able to maybe clarify some of this. But I want to give it a try first, because I was a Christian at one point too, and I would have maybe thought something along these lines. I always understood that sex inside of marriage, even as a Christian, was fair game. So anything goes. Two consenting adults who are married, oral sex, anal sex, foot fetish, armpit sniffing, whatever floats your boats. May your boats float together. And it had nothing to do with procreation, because even as a kid, I realized that there are a lot of people who can't have children, and so if you're married and you can't have children, does that mean you can't have sex? Well, no, that was stupid. That was stupid to me then. So you can't say, well, the only natural sex is procreative sex, because that kind of limits sex to certain kinds of people. But if you say, well, that's the only kind of natural sex, though, and so even if you can't have children, natural sex has to be the kind of sex that would result in children if children were possible. But that eliminates a lot of things that people do in their sex life. Kissing, for instance, a nice deep French kiss does not make babies. Kiss away, people. Might get mono, but you're not gonna get pregnant. Kissing, that's fine. It's very common in some relationships, required to eat out a cunt, or cunnilingus if you prefer. Cuntilingus, anybody? Anyway, yeah, that's done in marriage, and once again, you're probably not going to get to the part that you really want to do if you don't do that part.
Not to mention that the male G-spot is put in a fairly awkward place.
Sure. Look, there's a lot to it, but I'm just saying there are a lot of sexual things that couples do that are not procreative, and therefore maybe some Christians would say are not natural. So I don't know what we're even talking about when we're talking about natural and unnatural acts, or authorized and unauthorized acts. I have no idea what would be in that category and how we're supposed to know. Andrew, clear it up.
Yeah, not going to be something I can clear up here, I'm sure. I think there's at least what I'd have said back in my Bible school days is that we have instructions about certain things that we can't do from Romans chapter 1, right? So sodomy.
This is exactly where Dale went to. So
right.
You and Dale are of a mind here. Go ahead.
Well, so okay, you've just changed my inbox for the next week. Thanks. Look,
just want to say, Dale and Andrew agree 100% on sex. It's not true.
Okay.
Okay, so Andrew, before you continue, perhaps you can address, if God is so against sodomy, why did he put the male G-spot up the ass?
Well, there are a lot of things that people that don't have sex don't know about sex.
Let me just say, we're gonna get to a place where this is an appropriate question in question 5. Andrew, get back to explaining unnatural acts.
So I think passages like Romans chapter 1, and if I were being honest, I'd have said Genesis 19. So for those that don't know, Genesis 19 is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so there's a lot of Christian headcanon around Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, and around Romans chapter 1. But I think if you're just reading it with Christian eyes, and all of us here did except Darren, right? So Darren's going to read Romans chapter 1, Genesis 19, and similar passages, and he's going to say, I don't get it. But I do think that when you read it with Christian eyes, you have some reason to question what is natural and what is not. So I think it would work much like this. Anything that you would do with your female partner, anything that a male would do with his female partner that would result in procreation under some circumstances, so she's ovulating, those are natural acts. Anything that would result in a lack of reproduction would be something that is probably not natural, right? So that's why you can't have anal sex even with your wife, right? Because there are no conditions under which that would result in pregnancy eventually. So not all vaginal sex will result in pregnancy, but no anal sex would ever result in pregnancy.
But neither would kissing or cunnilingus or fellatio.
Well, so I think there's this sort of special space where you say, right, but the mouth never would anyway. And so then you just make this sort of special exception. You know, you've got this mouth and you're not doing anything else with it while you're having sex, right? So maybe kissing's okay. Look, I don't know how to I don't know how to make that work anymore. And I have done the best I could do with it, because some of these things we just were taught not to think about. And I think that's the real problem, is that some of these questions Christians are trained not to ask.
Okay. So look, I'm going to ask Darren to go on mute for a moment, which he already is. And Dale, you can give a thumbs down if you don't want to share in this, but you're the only one around here who can possibly say something remotely sensible on this subject, since a lot of this is your theory anyway. And so if in case I have mangled your thesis, I would like to give you a fair chance, and I will not respond to it, and I will hold all other people on the panel to agree to not respond to it. I just want you to be able to make a statement about this, so that we have a record of what you actually think on this, and maybe you can address some of the questions raised.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's so for me there's kind of torn, because there's sort of a behind the scenes issue that we won't get into, but at the same time, this is an important issue, and it does seem that I'm the only Christian here that is willing to address it and that sort of thing. Even Teddy was kind of a little bit off about coming on and doing that. So
some will come on next week. There were some things that happened, but we should have a broader discussion next week. But I got a feeling, even after we have a Christian panel, you're gonna have probably the best explanation of this.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, for the sake of the audience and everything, I think this is important to get out. So Yeah, so I think the question that we're on right now is by what criteria are certain sex acts approved versus not approved and that sort of thing. So generally, I have sort of four criteria. So this pertains to acts outside of sex as well as outside of marriage as well as within marriage. So the first one is what we've been kind of talking about. Number one, is it moral? Is it morally prohibited in the Bible or something like that? And that relates to this issue of spiritual harm and that sort of thing. But also number two, is the act mutually agreed upon? Is it consensual? So if you're putting pressure on whoever it is, even if it's a spouse, that's wrong and that sort of thing. If you're forcing your partner to do something they don't want to do in terms of a particular act or something, I think that's wrong. So
what if the particular act is just plain old vaginal sex, just procreative sex, and your partner doesn't want to do that?
It should not be coerced. Now that said, there is an element, and I know this was one of the questions that we'll get to, where it's not just about you. You're in a partnership and that sort of thing. So you do need to take into account the needs of the other partner and that sort of thing. So you don't, in the Bible, there's a verse that says you shouldn't deny each other for too long, kind of thing, right? Because human beings have needs and that sort of thing. So I do think that you have to take into account the needs of the other person in the relationship. And you can't just say, okay, we're never going to have sex again if you're a married couple. That's wrong to me as well. So yeah, there's that little twist on that one. The third thing is I think it should be mutually pleasurable. I think that sex is designed to be a pleasurable activity. So this potentially could rule out some, acts that make it a painful act, or people that are into like painful types of things. I'm not sure that's right. I think that God has designed sex to be mutually pleasurable. And finally, fourthly, it should serve this mutual bonding or this unity, oneness, intimacy, some people have called it. So those are the four criteria for me to kind of look at and say, is this act good or bad, and that sort of thing. And yeah, as you can tell, these relate to, okay, well, why are these things good? And that relates to the fact that there's harm, spiritual harm, if you violate one of these things. So yeah, with homosexuality or sex before marriage, I think that human beings have a certain design, and it goes back to Genesis. I would even as a history person, I would definitely use Genesis as saying this is the original design. It's the way we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be bonded, kind of thing, a male and a female in the proper context of marriage. Outside of that context, I think it causes spiritual harm. So one of the questions David wanted me to answer, what does that mean? Like, what do you mean by spiritual harm? And I think that, so in the first place, it's not going to be the same for every single person, but it relates to what I think sin in general does. All sin causes this spiritual harm. Some people have called it a progressive degeneration, right? So if you tell a lie, that causes spiritual harm, and it adds up. Maybe you don't notice it right away. It's not fully observant. It's not empirically testable or something like that, but sin is an infectious disease, and it infects and it gets worse and worse, and it builds up and stuff like that. So that's why, that's what I think is going on with the spiritual harm, and it affects different people differently. Some people are stronger than others. Other people, fall straight away into like sexual obsessions and stuff like that. I was watching in preparation for this show a video by Jonathan Doherty. He's an interesting guy.
I watched a few videos in preparation for this show too. Different channel. Go ahead. Sorry.
No worries.
Jonathan Doherty was not a part of them.
Gotcha. Well, he's a Christian, and he's outspoken. He struggled with porn addiction and then committing adultery, and and he, he talks in vivid detail about how his soul was warped over time and increasingly got worse and worse through his obsessions and stuff like that. And I think to varying degrees that happens to everybody. Whenever you sin in general, it leads up to this buildup of spiritual harm and compounding effects. But sex is even more powerful because it's even the Bible kind of differentiates sexual sins from others and says this kind of really impacts you because of the design of sex, where two people are bonding. It's the most so I'm not going to respond to that, but it's the most powerful bonding experience that human beings have, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, whatever you want to say. So yeah, that can deeply affect people, that sort of thing, when it goes wrong.
David, I wonder if you would permit a question.
Actually, I'm going to stay true to my promise to Dale. However, what I'm going to ask Dale, though, if you wouldn't mind, this show is not going to be as long as most of them. I promise. I think I promise. If you're still around at the end, Dale, could we do like a bonus show where we just talk for 20 minutes or so about this whole spiritual harm aspect? Because I do think it's important. I do think it deserves some conversation, and I don't really have anyone in my Rolodex who could discuss it better than you.
So do you know what time you're planning to wrap up at, or?
Given my choice, about 5 minutes, but we're only on question 2, so we've got to push through it. But if you don't mind deferring some of that,
Yeah.
I would love to just focus on that piece by itself, because there are some responses I have. I know that other people on the panel have some responses. We could do the rest of the show on that if we weren't careful. So I'd like to just do maybe something at the end of this one, and then we can sort out any internal issues we have and just have a conversation about that. Would that work for you?
It would, depending on when we end, just because I'm
Okay.
busy. But yeah, if it's like going past like 1:45, 2 o'clock, then probably not. But
Oh, no. Have you ever known me to have an excessively long show?
yes.
Point number 3.
Okay. Did I answer? There was one last thing. So
Go ahead and do that piece for the audience here, just in case the bonus material I do doesn't show up right away.
Gotcha. Yeah. So there was one last thing. Like the So obviously in the proper context, I was going to give this fire metaphor. I'm sort of like scanning over my notes and stuff, but sex is kind of like fire. It's good within certain contexts. Within a stove, it allows us to cook and that sort of thing because it's fulfilling its proper designed use or something within a controlled environment. But when it's in a different context, like it's just an uncontrolled fire on a sofa, well, that it becomes bad and that sort of thing. So that was the analogy for when it causes spiritual harm versus not. But the thing I wanted to address before we move on is you asked this question about, okay, but God allows in the Old Testament, he allows for divorce, he allows for people to have concubines and that sort of thing. So yeah, with that, I would say, number one, it's still not God's design plan. That goes back to Genesis, just like the New Testament tells us. This is God's original intent. It's true that God allows for divorce and that sort of thing. In fact, even today in the Christian era, God still allows for divorce among unbelievers. The commands not to get divorced are just for Christians. So I think that this might be controversial, but I think that Christian sexual union within marriage is superior to that of other marriages or sexual union within marriage of unbelievers. And it's that bonding aspect. God plays an active role in connecting the two individuals within Christian marriage. And that's why that bond is unbreakable, and it causes immense damage if you break that kind of thing. Whereas there's still proper bonding and stuff like that with unbelievers in heterosexual marriage, even homosexual marriage. There's bonding, but it's warped and it's harmful, and because of that, you can't connect to the same degree. So yeah, I guess the point here I'm saying is that I think that Christian marriage, sexual union within Christian marriage, is special, and we get a more solid bond, and that's why you can't get divorced once you do that.
Okay, so everybody here has some pushback for that, and everyone is just going to have to eat it for now, including me. But thank you, I appreciate that, and I think cutting that off is probably the hardest task I've ever done as a podcast host, because everything within me wants to respond to that right now. Number 3, do you endorse the idea that your body, sexually speaking, is not your own, but the property of your spouse? And are there any exceptions to this? So this question wasn't asked to you, Dale, just so you know, but to the audience in general. When I was a Christian, I would have said quite proudly, your body is not your own. And I would have been quoting scripture to say that. And so if there are Christians who are not aware of that scripture or where it is, look it up. It's your favorite book. Shouldn't be that hard to find. So that said, as a secularist, I can say that that is one of the most horrifying passages in the Bible to me. I find that idea to be so so backward and so representative of what is wrong in fundamental religion today. Now, to be fair, there was when I said something like that, or actually, it was in our back channeling, right? I think Brian with an I, who is one of the most thoughtful posters we have, had some things to say about that, and he brought up, if I recall correctly, I don't have it in front of me, military obligations where your ass belongs to Uncle Sam once you sign the dotted line there. So there are circumstances where your body is not your own, and those are things that you agree to prior to that. And one could say that, well, marriage is a thing where you agree that your bodies are not your own. But I think that there are some circumstances where you shouldn't be able to agree to sell your body, as it were, as a thing that belongs to someone else. I don't believe that a person should be able to sell themselves into slavery. Maybe they think that they are a lowly creature. Maybe they were born in the wrong caste in India, and being sold into slavery would be a high honor. I don't think that that should be allowed. I don't think that should be a good thing. So I do believe that there should be some limitations there. And you can say I'm being inconsistent considering my stance on suicide. Don't have time to go into why I don't think that's terribly inconsistent. But there's some conversation to be had around that. But in terms of marriage and sexuality, because this passage is specifically talking about sexuality, and as Dale mentioned, there's the one exception where you're going through some kind of spiritual thing, maybe a season of prayer and fasting, where you can say, yeah, I'm not having sex with this at this point, but those times have to be brief and rare, because your body belongs to your partner, and when your partner needs it, and you don't have the right to say no. And I think that there is never a time when you don't have the right to say no. And to think otherwise is just to be on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of humanity. And there's no theological argument that can move me on that score. That said, panel, anyone who wants to jump in there, body, your own.
I As I agree with you mostly, but I would say even if someone wants to sell themselves into slavery, they should be allowed to, as long as they're also allowed to change their mind whenever they want. I think a person's bodily autonomy is absolute, and whatever they want to do, they get to do, and whatever makes them happy, they get to do with their own body, regardless of how that affects everyone else, because it shouldn't affect anyone else. It's their body, it's their rules. They get to do with whatever they want.
So
Um,
I do agree with that, but we're just kind of redefining slavery a little bit when we say that, because if you say, yeah, but I can get out anytime I want to, it's not really slavery. And so in sexuality, there's the kind of the master slave relationship that works very well for a lot of people. A lot of women prefer this, but in those situations, the woman is always in control. It may not look like it to the outsider, but that's always the case. And so whoever the subservient party is, whether it's man or woman, that's the one who's actually in control of that situation.
The strange thing to me here is that in the Christian worldview, you have to wait and get married before you have sex. Now, if I'm not asking Dale to respond, but he's got a very common Christian view. So let's paint this the way it really is. A very common view that you have to wait until marriage, and then the first sex experience that you have with your partner is supposed to be this spiritual bonding experience that God actively participates in. And when you have sex with your partner for the first time, God waves the magic spirit sex toy, and everything is fantastic. Well, we know that not to be the case. And so the problem is that the Christian wants sex to be this somewhat magical uniting experience. But there are plenty of people that live in sexual relationships in their marriage who don't like the sex. It just doesn't work that way. And so what you've actually been asked to do is sign a contract that you have no idea whether you're actually going to want to fulfill or not. And if you don't want to, because it turns out that you're not compatible with your sexual partner, you have no recourse. It's not as if the New Testament allows for bad sex to be a reason for divorce. And so while I understand the theology, I think the theology is just wrong about the biology.
well,
and if I had to go ahead, Darren, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I was just going to say, and the theology actually promotes the bad sex in the first place, because sex is just like everything else. It's a skill, and you have to practice that skill in order to get good at it. And if you've got two people that have absolutely no clue what they're doing, getting married, and then they have these really high expectations of what sex is going to be, of course it's going to be crappy, because the first time you have sex, it's always crappy, because you don't have the skill to actually make it good.
Right.
Well,
or the knowledge.
it's great for at least one partner for 3 strong seconds. But the issue is, yes, sex turns and our desires turn. And so if a woman is stuck with a man after a few weeks who she just detests because he's awful, she can't say no. And you can't use the spiritual headache forever. Oh no, I can't do it now. I'm on my spiritual vision quest. Can't do that forever. And so at some point, she has to submit or be raped by her husband, because her body is not her own. This is just a thing that I would argue there's no defense to, and hopefully when the Christians come at me next week, they will defend this, and I will give any Christian as much time to talk about this in defense as they want to. But we're so close to the finish line. Number 4, if a young couple suffered the kind of disaster that left one of them incapable of sex, would it be okay for them to mutually agree to let the other have sex with someone else? As a Christian, I would have said no. Both parties are stuck with celibacy for the rest of their lives, even if the rest of their lives is another 70 years. As a on the other, but before I walked away from faith, I would have answered this question differently. I would have answered it with a lot more practicality, and I would have said, "Yeah, I think God would understand." And now I would say, "Yeah, what kind of loving relationship is this that you would deny your spouse the ability to have sex simply because you can't?" So I've gone all the way the other way on that. Does anyone have anything different on that?
No, I would just add that it does, whether the other person's capable or not of sex, I think as long as everyone's consenting and knows what's going on, then however they decide to make their relationship is perfectly fine, whether they want to do polypods or thruples or monogamy or however they want to do it.
Yeah, I think this idea of forced celibacy because your one and only partner can no longer have sex, or maybe they just don't want to have sex. Maybe they realize, you know what, I'm asexual, and I just don't want to do this. I love you. I want to stay with you. I want to support you in all you do, but I don't want to have sex with you. Do the sex thing with somebody else. You can't do it.
Right. Well, part of the disconnect between Christians and non-Christians here, but more specifically between the three monotheistic religions and those who are not religious, is that we recognize a wide range of things that can cause a relationship to end. And so sexual infidelity, if that's if you want to use these sorts of very loaded spiritual terms, that's just one reason that a relationship might end. And the non-religious community recognizes that there are a great many other reasons. You beat my kids. We just don't like each other anymore. One of us has a job and needs to move across the world, and the other one doesn't want to leave for whatever. There are all sorts of reasons, all sorts of very good reasons that relationships can end. And the part of the problem with this spiritual view of sex is that not only does it cause you to recognize the sexual relationship in some hyper-focused way, but it causes you to lose track of other very good reasons that you might not want to stay with a partner. So I think before you even get started here, there's this really big disconnect.
Yeah, so
and I'm not sure how to fix that.
I'm not slowing down to get Dale's thoughts on these because I know that it all goes back to spiritual harm, which is the piece that I want to go back and cover later. So just so you know. And then question 5. See, we're almost done. Does biology play a determining part of sexual preference? Obviously, this is a question that we can unpack for 3 hours easily. We are not going to do that. This deals with homosexuality and or non-binary gender fluidity, all that. And so the only question I want to deal with is there a biological component to it?
Yes.
If you're gay, is there a biological component? Darren says yes. I think
And
Andrew,
it's not a component, it's the entire thing. The biology, the evidence is overwhelming. The biology is what your sexual preference is.
I would agree.
And your gender identity and your sexual preferences are not the same thing.
Right.
And that's also all biology.
It's correct me if I'm wrong. It's YY for a girl, XY
XX,
for
XX for a girl,
XX for a girl, YY
XY.
XY for a boy. And yet those are not the only two options. We have XXY,
XY, XYY,
XYY, and this is just genetics at the most base level. And so if you're saying that the thing that makes you a boy is XY and the thing that makes you a girl is XX, when you have some other combination of that, you're something else. And that's, and I don't actually care what the gross anatomical parts are at that point.
I was reading a genetics article. If I can find it, I'll send it to you so you can put it in the show notes. But I think it's really important for this part of this conversation on SNS. While it is the case that male sexual characteristics occur from the Y chromosome, it is not the case that the entire Y chromosome is devoted to just male sexual characteristics. Here's why that's important. We do have rare instances that are now well documented of someone who has a Y chromosome that does not have gross external male sexual characteristics. And so all I'm saying is even the biology where chromosomes are concerned is quite sophisticated. It is possible to miss that part of the Y chromosome that gives you male sexual characteristics. And we also have documented cases where female sexual characteristics, which occur on the X chromosome, are missing. I didn't know this was a thing until last week. And like I said, if I can find the study, I'll send it to you, because I think it's just another one of those misunderstandings where even when we say, oh, well, XX is female and XY is male, and XXY and XYY are possible, and even more exotic combinations, that doesn't in itself even answer all of the possible genetic possibilities. It's a much more broad landscape than,
right, and it's
non-professionals recognize.
It's not as simple as gender fluidity either. So that's not the only thing that we're talking about, and I don't want to conflate, as I have done so far, gender fluidity with sexual preference. So you can be all man and still have a sexual preference for a man. You can be all woman and still have sexual preference for a woman, or you can be any combination of the things, or you can be, you can have masculine traits, what we consider masculine traits, and be a man or a woman, and have feminine traits and be what we would consider man or woman. So it's actually a much bigger stew pot than all of that. But I would say that one of the reasons that that your sexual preference is natural is you don't have to interview that many people. You can just first of all start with yourself and say who makes you horny, who makes you who does that special thing for you, and if you're what we call a straight male or female, it's going to be a type of guy or type of gal. It's going to be the opposite sex that does it for you, and it's not something that you think about. It's not something that you decide. You didn't decide that you liked girls. You just like girls.
And why would it be bad if you did?
Well, no, you're right. It wouldn't be bad if you did, but I'm just saying it's not something that you did. You didn't. There was no point in your life where you said, I think I'm gonna go with girls. No, that's what did it for you. And if you're by the way, you didn't decide that either. Now you might choose what flavor you want to have tonight, but you didn't decide whether you are turned on by both girls and boys. You just are. And if you like the same sex, once again, you didn't decide that you like the same sex. You just like the same sex. And people of the opposite sex don't turn you on. It's a thing that we don't have to apply any cognitive effort to understand our sexual preference. And so I think the best the Christian can say here is that, but whatever the mechanism is that chooses our sexual preference was broken in the fall. So once again, it's going to come back to spiritual harm and spiritual good at some point. And so those things will be covered. But I just wanted I just wanted to have a chance to lay out some of the landscape here, that this, in fact, all of this is biological. And so you can come up with excuses for why the biology is that way. I think it's very hard for a Christian to say, but there's no biological component to it. You can just say the biological component is broken. So that said, we will see how the Christians respond to some of this next week. And we will do some discussion a little bit after this to talk about spiritual harm, and I'll put that in a separate show, I think. So it will be a little bonus show for the middle of the week. But I'm very anxious to have that conversation right now. So I'm gonna cut it off right there. I'm gonna say thanks for listening. skepticsandseekers.squarespace.com. You can send me an email. I read them all, skepticsandseekers@gmail.com. And yeah, let's talk about sex. Until next week. Bye-bye.